For anyone looking from the outside, it's overwhelming. Every word, every action and event, charged with meaning and passion, and is seen through so many lenses that the full picture becomes a blur. And the deeper you go, the more you realize it's not just about what happened, it's about who's telling the story. So where do you begin with a conflict like this? You can read multiple books, dive into various sources, trying to find some sort of unbiased picture. But early on, you realize there is no easy way out of this rabbit hole.
Saudi
Arabia? No. Soviet Union?
At its core, it's a battle of national aspirations, a claim to the same holy land. But this isn't just about borders or territory. It's knitted into centuries of history, faith, politics, and much more. At the heart of it is a powerful conviction the Jewish people hold. The belief that Israel is their ancestral homeland. It's rooted in ancient history, deeply interconnected with religious texts, and a profound cultural and sacred bond that has persisted for thousands of years. Now, for many of us, ancient religious texts and holy books written centuries ago might seem irrelevant, but as we will discover, religion does play a complex role and continues to shape it in ways that go beyond just politics.
Side by side with the Jewish population, the Arabs, outnumbering them 2-1.
If you look at the Jewish narrative, the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey, is mentioned more than 20 times in the Bible. This explains in part why this land holds deep historical significance for Jewish people. According to Jewish sources, it's where their ancestors established the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, ruling for over 500 years. With the arrival of Roman Empire, everything changed. After a series of wars and destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish population was destroyed. Many were killed, enslaved, or forced into exile. Tens of thousands were sold into slavery. In a symbolic move to erase Jewish identity, the Romans renamed Judea as Syria-Palestina. The name Palestina evoked memories of Philistines, an ancient enemy tribe of the Jews. Now, even after their dispersal, Jewish communities never detached their deep cultural and religious ties to the land of Israel. One of the most persistent symbols of Jewish connection to the land is the phrase
Shana Haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem,
a prayer recited for centuries. By the 7th century, the Arab conquests brought the region under Muslim rule. The Treaty of Omar guaranteed religious freedom for Christians and Jews, allowing them to practice their faiths freely, given that they paid a jizya tax. Under the various Muslim caliphates, Palestine became part of Bilad al-Sham, or Greater Syria. The Muslim conquest introduced Islam as the dominant faith. Over time, as Islam spread, the region's religious demographics shifted, yet a significant Jewish and Christian population continued to call it home. The region would remain under Muslim rule for next 1200 years until the early 20th century. During the Ottoman Empire, something interesting happened. The Ottomans introduced a series of reforms, and these reforms reshaped property rights across the empire, giving marginalized communities, including Jews, new opportunities to actively participate in land acquisition. The equal rights established by these reforms opened the door for Jewish immigration and settlement, enabling land purchases from Arab landowners. Many of these Arab landowners were absentee landlords, powerful families who had the ownership of the land but they lived outside Palestine. This shift in property rights marked a significant turning point, laying the groundwork for future tensions in the region. While the Ottoman reforms of the mid-19th century were opening doors for Jewish land acquisition in Palestine, another force was reshaping Jewish history in Europe. The late 19th century saw a sharp rise in anti-Semitism, fueled by racial theories that excluded Jews from emerging national identities. In Russia and across Europe, Jews faced escalating violence and persecution. Against this backdrop, Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. Herzl was a journalist working in Paris in early 1890s, and he had witnessed the power of anti-Semitic campaigns. In 1896, he published Der Judenstaat, arguing that establishment of a Jewish state was the only solution to end deep-rooted anti-Semitism in Europe. At the Zionist Congress, delegates agreed to form the World Zionist Organization. This marked a turning point in the quest for a Jewish homeland. A land without a people for a people without a land. Now here are two very conflicting narratives. On the one hand, scholars point out that Palestine wasn't a land without people, a fact that some Jewish leaders acknowledged early on. a prominent Jewish thinker, visited Palestine and observed, "It is difficult to find fields that are not sowed." He said, "If the time comes when our people in Palestine grow to a point where they displace the native inhabitants, they will not give up their place easily." On the other hand, we have a Jewish narrative which claims the land was indeed empty.
It was a barren land. It really had, practically it was an empty land.
The Israeli narrative often emphasizes the legal purchases of the land by Jewish settlers from absentee landowners during the Ottoman and British Mandate periods. Supporters of Zionism argue that Jewish immigration was largely beneficial, bringing economic development and infrastructure to the region. From this perspective, the Jewish settlers were not seeking to displace the Arab populations, but to revive and rejuvenate a land they looked at as historically tied to Jewish identity. The Palestinian rebuttal to this, to put it in simple terms, is, isn't this the basic definition of colonialism? I'll leave it for you to decide. In the late 19th century, driven by the energy of Zionist Movement, waves of Jewish migration to Palestine, known as First and Second Aliyah, began to take shape. Between these early migrations, roughly 60 to 70,000 Jews made their way to the land, bringing with them hopes of rebuilding their ancestral homeland. Though still a minority compared to the larger Arab population, they laid the foundation of the Jewish community in Palestine and created a distinct identity for themselves. Their arrival sparked the beginnings of a cultural and social transformation. Now, it's important to understand that there was no independent nation-state called Palestine in the modern sense of the word during the Ottoman period. The region known as Palestine wasn't a distinct political entity with defined borders or a central government. It was divided into smaller administrative districts, which were parts of larger provinces or wilayats governed by the Ottoman Empire. These divisions reflected the broader administrative organization of the empire rather than any national identity. This fragmented structure is key to understanding the region's complex history before the rise of modern nationalism. After World War I, the Middle East experienced dramatic changes with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, leading to a complete reshaping of the region. The victorious Allied powers took charge of redrawing the map through a series of treaties, agreements, and mandates. They'd created new political boundaries and nation-states. One of the most significant outcomes was the establishment of the British Mandate for Palestine, placing the region under British control. In 1917, the British issued one of the most consequential statements in modern Middle Eastern history, the Balfour Declaration. This statement expressed British support for establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while vaguely promising to protect the rights of non-Jewish communities. Now, the problem was that Britain had already promised Arab nations about their independence, while simultaneously agreeing with France that the region would be placed under international administration. A web of conflicting promises that would have a significant impact in the years to come. The Israelis look at the Balfour Declaration as a historic milestone in the fulfillment of Jewish ambitions for a homeland in Palestine. From this perspective, the statement is seen as a legitimate and a moral recognition of Jewish people's historic connection to the land after centuries of exile, persecution, and longing for return. During the British Mandate period, the Jewish community in Palestine quickly organized themselves politically, economically, and militarily. Jewish leaders seized the opportunities provided by the British administration. In contrast, Arab leadership remained fragmented and disorganized. The lack of unified front, combined with the leadership's unwillingness to compromise and participate in political processes, left the Arab population at a disadvantage. This further widened the gap between the two communities. Tensions between the Jewish and Muslim populations in the region escalated sharply between 1920s and 1940s. One of the most significant flashpoints was the Great Arab Revolt, a large-scale uprising against British rule and Jewish immigration. Driven by anger over British land policies, economic inequalities, and the fear of losing control of Palestine, Arab forces rebelled against the administration. British troops, with the support of Jewish paramilitary groups like the Haganah, eventually crushed the revolt, but the violence left deep scars between the Jewish and Arab communities, intensifying hostilities. In the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, the Jewish leadership launched the 1 Million Plan, a bold strategy to rapidly increase the Jewish population in Palestine. The plan aimed to bring 1 million Jews to the region, primarily Holocaust survivors from war-torn Europe. Although the plan didn't reach its full scale, at least 250,000 Jews immigrated during this period, setting the stage for even greater demographic changes and escalating tensions. From the Jewish perspective, the Arab Revolt is seen as violent rejection of Jewish immigration and the legitimate rights of the Jews to return to their ancestral homeland. Many Jews looked at Arab Revolt as a threat to their very existence in Palestine. As attacks on Jewish settlements, farms, and civilians escalated, Jewish paramilitary groups like the Haganah were formed to protect the community from these attacks, reinforcing the idea of self-defense in the face of growing hostility. This narrative portrays Arab leaders as unwilling to compromise, particularly on Jewish immigration. From that side, the revolt is seen as a reflection of Arab refusal to coexist with the Jewish community. The growing tensions between Jews and Arabs, which the Britain struggled to resolve, eventually led Britain to hand the issue of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. The UN proposed the Partition Plan that aimed to divide the region into two independent states, a Jewish one and an Arab one. For the Jewish side, this plan was a major step towards the long-awaited dream of a Jewish state.
The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision.
Israeli leaders accepted the plan. The Arab leadership, on the other hand, rejected the plan outright, viewing it as unjust, particularly given the land distribution. They argued the Partition Plan was unfairly biased in favor of the Jewish population. The plan proposed to allocate 55% of land to the Jewish state, even though Jews constituted about 1/3 of the population and owned only 7% of the land. On the other hand, the Jewish community saw this rejection as a refusal to acknowledge Jewish right to self-determination, deepening the divide between the two groups and setting a stage for further conflict. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate expired, Jewish leadership seized a historic moment, declaring the establishment of the State of Israel. This was immediately met by resistance. Neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded newly formed Israel, sparking the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known to the Israelis as the War of Independence, and to the Palestinians as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. The war led to the displacement of around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, many of whom fled to the neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, expecting to return home once the fighting ended, but the return never came. As Israel solidified its borders, it refused to allow the return of the refugees, arguing that the Arab states were responsible for the refugee crisis by initiating hostilities. From the Israeli perspective, the decision not to allow Palestinian refugees to return after the 1948 war was influenced by several factors. The primary concern included security risk, demographic shifts, and the political implications. Israeli leaders were concerned that allowing a mass return of refugees could undermine the state's security, given the recent conflict between Jewish and Arab populations. Throughout the 1950s and the 60s, tensions along Israel's border intensified, particularly with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Arab nationalist movements, led by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, increasingly called for Israel's destruction. Arab alliances heightened Israel's fear of encirclement. The situation reached a breaking point in 1967 when Nasser closed the Strait of Tiran and Israel's shipping access to Red Sea and mobilized troops in the Sinai Peninsula, signaling an imminent attack. In response, Israel launched a preemptive strike, igniting what became the Six-Day War. In less than a week, Israel achieved a stunning military victory, capturing vast territories that more than tripled its size. The Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip fell from Egyptian control, the West Bank and East Jerusalem were seized from Jordan, and the Golan Heights were taken from Syria. This swift and decisive victory not only altered the map of the Middle East, but also gave Israel crucial strategic depth, transforming its position in the region. In response to the war, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 242 in November 1967, calling for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from those territories and the recognition of every state's right to live in peace. This resolution became the basis for further peace negotiations, although the interpretation of its terms remained disputed. The war's outcome also shifted the center of Palestinian resistance. With Arab governments reeling from defeat, the focus moved to Palestinian organizations, most notably the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which emerged as the primary voice for Palestinian nationalism. Initially conceived as a pan-Arab initiative, the PLO quickly evolved into a driving force, especially under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, who assumed control in 1969. However, the path to this transformation was turbulent. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred during September 1970. At the time, the PLO operated from Jordan, using its bases to launch attacks on Israel, a move that strained relations with Jordan's King Hussein. Fearing the PLO's growing power within his own country, Hussein's government clashed with the PLO, resulting in a brutal conflict that left thousands dead. By the end, the PLO was expelled from Jordan and forced to relocate its bases of operation to Lebanon, setting the stage for its next chapter in the struggle for the Palestinian nationalhood. From their new bases in Lebanon, the PLO began launching attacks on northern Israel, heightening tensions across the border. The immediate spark for Israel's 92 invasion, however, came from a different source.
Out of the late-night crowds on London's Park Lane and fired deliberately into the ambassador's head.
Although the PLO denied involvement, Israel used this incident as justification for a full-scale invasion of Lebanon.
The more hawkish members of the cabinet, led by the defense minister, have been pressing for 3 months for a massive invasion of the Lebanon to crush the PLO's strongholds there once and for all.
On June 6, 1982, Israeli forces stormed across the border, aiming to push PLO fighters out of rocket range from Israel's northern towns. The invasion soon spiraled into one of the most controversial episodes of the conflict, the Sabra and Chilia massacres. Lebanese Christian militias allied with Israel entered 2 Palestinian refugee camps and slaughtered hundreds of civilians. The world was horrified. With Israeli forces controlling the area at the time, global outrage grew, and accusations of Israel's complicity, or at the very least failure to prevent the atrocity, severely tarnished its international standing. The massacre left deep scars on the region and cast a long shade over Israel's militancy campaigns in Lebanon. But from the Israeli perspective, its invasion of Lebanon in 1982, often referred to as Operation Peace for Galilee, is looked at as a necessary defensive action to protect northern Israeli towns from persistent PLO rocket attacks. For years, the PLO had been launching assaults from southern Lebanon, targeting civilians, and the Israeli government felt it had no choice but to act decisively to eliminate the threat posed by these militants. One of the most significant and unintended consequences of Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon was the rise of Hezbollah. Backed by Iran and Syria, this Shia militant group emerged as a fierce resistance to Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon. Over time, Hezbollah evolved into a powerful political and military force, not only dominating Lebanon's internal security, but also becoming one of Israel's most formidable enemies in the region. Meanwhile, in December 1987, tensions in the Palestinian territories reached a tipping point after an Israeli vehicle tragically killed 4 Palestinians in Gaza. Years of frustration boiled over, igniting the first Intifada. A violent uprising crossed the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. For Israelis, this sudden eruption of protests was alarming, with the Palestinian youths hurling stones and turning once quiet towns into violent battlegrounds. Amid this unrest, another force began to rise: Hamas. Founded in 1987, Hamas positioned itself as an Islamic alternative to more secular PLO, which it criticized for being too willing to negotiate with Israel. Unlike the PLO, Hamas refused to recognize Israel's right to exist and called for the establishment of an Islamic state across all of the historic Palestine. Hamas used a mix of political activism and violent resistance, including suicide bombings, to oppose Israel's occupation. Its charter outlined a mission of liberating Palestine through jihad, drawing heavily on both religious fervor and nationalist ideas. This marked the start of Hamas as a central player in the ongoing conflict, further complicating an already fractured Palestinian resistance. After years of armed struggle, the PLO gradually shifted its focus from military operations to diplomatic efforts. One of the major turning points came in 1988 when, under Yasser Arafat's leadership, the PLO declared Palestinian independence. In a dramatic move, the PLO also endorsed UN Resolution 242, which implicitly recognized Israel's right to exist. Scholars believe that this movement presented the PLO's recognition of the need for a diplomatic solution and its willingness to compromise. In his famous speech at the United Nations, Arafat extended an olive branch to signal PLO's readiness to pursue peace. He said, "I come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun. Don't let olive branch fall from my hand." The most dramatic manifestation of the PLO's transformation came with signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. After secret negotiations in Norway, the PLO and Israel made history by agreeing to mutual recognition. The Oslo Accords marked beginnings of a formal peace process and led to the creation of Palestinian Authority, a semi-autonomous governing body in parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The Oslo Accords signaled a major shift in Palestinian politics, where diplomacy became the primary tool for pursuing peace. The Camp David summit in 2000 was another high-stake attempt to resolve the conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat met with the goal of addressing borders for a future Palestinian state, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and Israeli security concerns. Although hopes for peace were high, the talks ultimately broke down. Barak offered substantial concessions, even proposing a possible division of Jerusalem, but Arafat rejected the proposals, particularly due to the lack of guarantee on Palestinian refugee rights. The summit ended in mutual frustration, with each side blaming the other for failure. The collapse of the talks set the stage for the eruption of Second Intifada, a violent uprising against Israeli occupation. The Second Intifada led to widespread violence, with Palestinians launching suicide bombings and armed attacks, while Israel responded with military operations, including airstrikes and targeted killings of Palestinian leaders. Both sides suffered heavy losses, with thousands of deaths. The conflict deepened mistrust between Israelis and Palestinians, further entrenching both sides in a cycle of violence and retaliation. The aftermath of the Second Intifada had lasting consequences. It led to the construction of Israel's West Bank barrier and the rise of Hamas as a political and military force in Palestinian society. Although the violence had largely subsided by 2005, the root causes of the conflict, territorial disputes, security concerns, and refugee rights remained unresolved, leaving a fragile and volatile peace in the region. Following the violent collapse of the Second Intifada, the Gaza disengagement in 2005 marked a new chapter in the conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon made the unilateral decision to withdraw military forces and remove around 8,000 Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip. This move was intended to reduce security risks for Israel and consolidate control over key parts of the West Bank. However, while the disengagement officially ended Israel's direct presence in Gaza, Israel maintained control over its borders, airspace, and coastline. The Palestinian Authority, led by Fatah, nominally took control of Gaza after Israeli withdrawal, but the situation quickly became worse. In 2007, internal Palestinian divisions reached a breaking point. Following Hamas's victory in 2006 Palestinian legislative elections, tensions with Fatah escalated into a violent power struggle. Hamas's electoral victory intensified the rivalry between the two movements. Hamas forcibly seized control of Gaza after days of intense fighting, effectively ousting Fatah and establishing its rule over the territory. This left the Palestinian territories politically fractured, with two distinct entities, Hamas ruling the Gaza and Fatah controlling the West Bank. This split created two de facto states, making any comprehensive peace efforts difficult to achieve. The division had far-reaching consequences. Following Hamas's takeover, Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade on Gaza, further isolating the territory economically and politically. The fragmentation of Palestinian governance and the rise of Hamas as a dominant force in Gaza have made the prospects of achieving a unified political approach to negotiations with Israel highly challenging. The consequences of this split have been felt not only in politics but also in a series of military confrontations between Israel and Hamas. Intense violence, heavy casualties, and a deepening humanitarian crisis in Gaza, Israeli-Gaza wars of 2008, 2012, and 2014. The first conflict in 2008, known as Operation Cast Lead, began after increased rocket fires from Gaza prompted Israeli airstrikes aimed at weakening Hamas's military capabilities. In 2012, tensions flared again during Operation Pillar of Defense, triggered by the assassination of Hamas military leader Ahmad Jabari. Both sides exchanged rocket fire, and the week-long conflict ended with over 160 Palestinians and 6 Israeli deaths. The 2014 war, Operation Protective Edge, was the deadliest and most destructive of the three. Sparked by a series of kidnappings and killings, the conflict escalated in a 50-day war that left over 2,200 Palestinians and 73 Israelis dead. The diplomatic landscape of the Middle East shifted significantly with signing of Abraham Accords in 2020, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab countries, including the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. The accords, brokered by the United States, were a historic breakthrough in Israeli-Arab relations. These accords signify a realignment of the Middle East. For Israel, the accords represented a diplomatic win, breaking its isolation in region and opening doors for trade, security, economic development, and much more. The normalization agreements with Arab states helped Israel solidify its status as a regional power, and these accords were seen as a part of a broader shift in the region's strategic alliances. However, the Abraham Accords were met with sharp criticism for Palestinian leadership, who saw them as a betrayal. The Abraham Accords reflect the marginalization of Palestinian cause, as Arab states prioritize their national interests or solidarity with Palestinians. While the Abraham Accords marked a major shift in Middle East diplomacy, they left the core issue of Israeli-Palestinian conflict unresolved, further diminishing the Palestinian bargaining power and their hopes for statehood. In mid-2021, tensions between Israel and Hamas once again boiled over into a large-scale conflict. The violence was triggered by tensions in East Jerusalem, particularly around Al-Aqsa Mosque and Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, where Palestinian families faced eviction. In response to the unrest, Hamas fired rockets into Israel, prompting Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. The conflict lasted 11 days, resulting in over 250 Palestinian deaths and 13 Israeli deaths. As we approach the present day, the conflict between Israel and Palestine remains as complex and devastating as ever. The attacks on October 7 have reignited intense violence, adding another tragic chapter in the history of this conflict. The violence has only deepened humanitarian crises, amplifying suffering on both sides. As we reflect on these events, it's important to understand that this is not a conflict defined by simple narratives. To fully understand its intricacies, we must be willing to explore multiple perspectives grounded in history, politics, and human rights. I encourage you to continue reading, researching, and seeking an unbiased understanding of this deeply rooted conflict. Only through education and empathy can we hope to grasp the complex layers that define the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and work towards a more informed and just resolution for all.